Welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast, a weekly show featuring B2B sales leaders and executives. Hosted by five-time CRO John McMahon and Force Management co-founder John Kaplan, the show takes guests in the barrel, behind the scenes with the people who've been there, done that, and seen the results. Revenue Builders covers best practices for scaling and growing your business while sharing the pitfalls to avoid. Enjoy today's episode.
Today, we're joined by Sahir Azam, partner at Index Ventures. Before entering the world of venture capital in 2025, Sahir was the chief product officer at MongoDB, where he was a primary architect behind one of the most successful cloud transformations in tech history. He took MongoDB Atlas from day zero project to a multi-billion-dollar platform. Sahir is a rare hybrid leader. He cut his teeth as an application engineer in the high-intensity sales culture at Blade Logic before becoming a world-class product visionary. Today, he's at the forefront of the AI revolution, investing in the infrastructure that allows software to see, hear, and speak.
Dude, can I give it a little bit more? I'm just telling you, I've been waiting for this doggone podcast for a while. Sahir is an absolute intellect giant. Superstar. And I got to tell you, Johnny, what came out of this podcast for me is the greatest articulation that I've heard in where AI is right now and where it's going. And I can't wait for our listeners to hear it.
Yeah, what he does is he simplifies things, right? He puts things in layman terms. He puts them and he breaks them down into different buckets so it's easy for almost anyone to understand where AI is today and where it's going.
Giddy up. Let's take a listen.
All right. So Sahir, after being an application engineer, you rose through the ranks on the product side of the business to become the chief product officer at MongoDB. And as you look back, are there two or three learnings that, stick with you today?
Yeah, absolutely. Good to see you again, John. So a couple things.
Sahir, always a pleasure to see you, brother.
So a few things as I've been reflecting on this, now sort of 6+ months kind of removed from being an operator. I think first and foremost, I think the couple traits that really stick out that I've seen, be successful in my career, but also the best people in MongoDB and just in the best companies I've worked with is first and foremost adaptability. As I think back at almost 10 years at MongoDB, my job changed significantly every year or two in terms of the skills and where my day and hours of the day were being spent. And so I think really being intentional about leaning into how your role changes is kind of critical for anyone to be successful in a growth company, because that's just the nature of the game. I think the other, which comes across, I think, a little bit more often in the ecosystem, but I think is super critical, is the idea of kind of resilience, grit. That whole concept is super important. It's really easy from the outside to say, I want to be at a hyper growth company. It sounds amazing. Obviously, there's a lot of upside in that if it goes well. But I think people underestimate how hard it is and how many challenges they are and how many things, you're going to hit a wall against, and you need to just kind of brush it off and be fine kind of moving forward to continue building the business. And I think the combination of adaptability and resilience are really, I think, the critical components to success for anyone wanting to be in a high-tech growth environment. And then I think the last one, that certainly I thought a lot about it over my career was, it's very easy to simplify tech companies into people who build the products and people who sell the products. And I had a mentor very early in my career back at Blade Logic when we were together, John, there, that said, there's a real power in being in the middle of those and being able to translate and connect the go-to-market organization and how we sell the products with the technology and the engineers who are building it, and really being that sort of center, keeping things holistic and coherent. And so I think those three things are the important pieces as I kind of look back a little bit from a distance and distill it down that are most important.
Yeah, well, you've actually said that in a hyper growth company, you have to relearn your job every 18 months. And the way that I look at it is, when you're talking about adaptability and resilience, there's many moments in my career too where I had to look in the mirror and go, John, you have to adapt. You have to change now. And it's a tough conversation that you have to have with yourself. And then you have to go relearn new skills. So yeah, that's super
Yeah,
important.
on the adaptability piece, you're a rare bird, Sahir, where you can move so fluently throughout these organizations. I think that has a lot to do with your intellect and the resilience and the adaptability that you're talking about. Can you give some advice? Because so many people talk about this, like you got to be adaptable, but the things that you were doing, you were moving into areas that, it might not have been resourced the way that it needed to be. There might have been an idea at the board, or it might have been an idea from the product people. And you not only have to just say, I'm going to be ready to go in that environment. You have to go like where people haven't gone before. And can you just give some advice on that, on the resiliency piece? Because very rarely is it all set up. Okay, so here's your budget, here's your resources, here's your, go build this and stay in your little test tube, and we'll come bug you for budget, whenever it just doesn't work that way. So can you talk a little bit deeper about that? Because
Yeah.
a lot of people move into an environment and the company wasn't ready, they weren't committed, and it's the land of the misfit toys.
Yeah, I think if I really distill a lot of what's necessary down, it comes to the fundamentals of selling in my mind. To your point, when I joined, MongoDB, there was definitely like a belief in the company that they needed to launch this cloud product, and kind of uh, that could in many ways be the future of the company. But there was also just a lot of organizational inertia, which came across as resistance, but I don't think it was actually resistance that was driving it. And so it took a lot you know, of me selling internally why this was important for the company and very strategic, what the incentives were for the various functional leaders that, had a day job, had a working team, and I needed to make it a win for them to invest in something that was unknown and different and change the very nature of their function sometimes. And so really deeply understanding kind of what drove those leaders and helping them see that as a win. And also just like being in the trenches and not just being like, okay, this is strategic, go execute and do your job and report back to me as the GM of it. Like, but actually being in all the early deals and helping drive a lot of the sales enablement or figure out how the customer success organization changes in a consumption-based model, all of these types of things, to build the trust of the organization to bring them along are ultimately distilled down to selling characteristics in my mind in terms of understanding people's incentives and making sure they get a win out of it. And I think that really came in my case, because I happened to join Blade Logic in the early part of my career and, obviously the incredible sales culture there and what I got to learn from, a lot of the formative leaders there. I think that has helped in many, many ways across the rest of my career. But that's kind of the thing that I think helps bring an organization around, even if it seems on paper like a good idea. It's a lot of that just change management and people stuff at the end of the day that matters.
So
I
you
love
talk
that.
about, product market fit and also go to market fit. So do you
Mhm.
think that based upon your experience that a lot of product leaders would be better off starting in the field?
Yeah, obviously I'm biased in that because I started in the field, in pre-sales, a bit of sales, and it's a fair amount of product marketing work as well. So I view that as being, a huge advantage to how I approach the job when I moved into product in the second half of my career, for sure. That's not to say that every chief product officer or product leader has to start in the field, but if you're not, then I think you have to over rotate and really spending the time with sales, with pre-sales engineering, with customer success, with professional services and be out there to try to inject that sort of empathy and understanding of how complex those jobs and how hard those jobs really are.
And then you started the PLG motion, at MongoDB, and you were definitely active in at the enterprise sales motion. So you see a lot of founders today that, they get a lot of love on the PLG side and they start on the PLG side. Then they have a really
Yeah.
difficult time, or sometimes almost an impossible time branching over to the enterprise side. So why do some of those people fail? Why can't they make that bridge?
There's a lot behind that. I think if at the foundation, I think it's really important for any, person building a technology and trying to find product market fit to deeply understand the customer behavior in terms of who makes the buying decision and who's the actual user and how those two cohorts kind of interact. And, I say that because I think there was a time in which like PLG was all the rage on every podcast and everything. And I'd get calls and be like, oh, how'd you move Mongo from enterprise sales to PLG? And I'm like, I never looked at it as an either or. It was like there were some segments of the market and direct to developer adoption that wasn't going to happen because a very savvy seller outbound, cold called into them. And therefore we needed a very frictionless self-service way to meet startups and developers that are getting hands-on. And on the other side, there were large enterprises who were regulated that are never going to buy anything on a credit card. And you needed a very sophisticated seller to understand how to even break in and get that first land, let alone the large expansion and enterprise relationships over time. And so what I cared about was how do I get this product as big as possible into as many customers in as many segments globally, and then work backwards from that to a go-to-market architecture that combined aspects of PLG, high velocity sales, customer success, and then of course strategic enterprise selling for the large accounts. And we tried to do that in a way that was cohesive, and the handoffs of customers across those channels was also as smooth as possible. And that's a constant work in progress. It's like never done. And the reason I think that's important is I think a lot of times it's just too simple to say, okay, I would love to have a PLG motion, but my product doesn't even ever work that way. It's always going to be a top-down decision. Or conversely, a product starts with PLG in the bottom of the market, and then the board's like, hey, you got to go up market, drive higher
100%.
ASPs. And like that's a retooling of the whole product and the whole company in a lot of ways. And so you got to be recognize what that takes to make it happen.
That's where I think they get caught. They get caught in a trap. They start in only PLG. They build a financial model and a company around the PLG motion with no emphasis at all on the enterprise. Then the board tells them you got to get bigger deals. You got to go up market. And the company's just not made or built, and the financial model's not made or built to do that.
I think
and the culture. There's a cultural shift that needs to happen. And, the founder or CEO in particular has to be open-minded enough to say that, listen, I need to view sales and distribution with the same intensity and differentiation as I view the product and the technology. And that's really something I learned from, Dave from Blade Logic all the way through Mongo was like, it's equal parts differentiating on both sides of that. And I think that gets lost a little bit, especially with technical founders.
I think the other thing is if you don't hear the mindset and the context around outside in versus inside out, if all of your reasons for making a move are like growth, revenue, and especially in the old days when they started trying to go to, from enterprise, now we got entered, we're going to do a lower cost of sale, we're going to go into PLG. Those were all inside out thinking. Nobody was thinking about a customer. Nobody was thinking about how that customer buys. Hardly anybody was thinking about what's that going to do to our existing go-to-market infrastructure. So there's two big things I've always thought that you've done really, really well. The biggest one is this outside-in mentality. The first thing you always seem to ask is, okay, what's the impact on my customer? And in your case, your customer wasn't just the end customer. Oftentimes, your customer were the other constituents inside the company. I think that has a ton to do with your success. Huge.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were lucky to have just a great, team across the board. I know you've had Cedric Pasha on the program before. Like he and I had an amazing partnership over the years. Trying to construct the right balance of PLG versus sales, or how we expanded the new products and all of that. And ultimately, it does take, the hard work of all those functions trying to be working in tandem, even if it's not always perfect.
Well done.
So Sahir, I know, from experience that as the chief product officer, you were extremely involved in the sales side of the business, making countless sales calls all over the world.
A lot of miles.
Yeah, a lot of miles. And as you think back, can you think about some of the salespeople you saw and the best attributes of the best salespeople?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few things that I call out. One, and I think it's critically important, especially in today's buying environment, is intellectual curiosity. Technical buyers have an increasing or decreasing, tolerance for sellers who don't know the product and the technology and how it gets used in the reality of the organization. And I think if you're not intellectually curious enough to really understand the product and the technology, I don't think you're going to have credibility. And I've seen that actually change over my career where the bar gets higher and higher around that. And it doesn't mean that you need to be deeply technical, but you need to be able to spend the time to learn and be able to connect with that audience. And I think the other aspect is even if you're selling high in an organization, the average CIO today is much more technical than they were,
Hmm.
15 years ago. And so the idea of it just being like a, business relationship sale, I think is very rare today. Sure, that's additive, but I think it starts with really understanding the business problem and the technology in a way that really can connect with the buyer. And so that intellectual curiosity, I think, is the through line for all the best sellers, no matter what personality and background and profile they've had. I think the second thing I've seen, especially for complex enterprise sales, is the sellers that orchestrate the resources in the organization on their
Uh,
behalf are really powerful. It's not like they're always the face of it. They're obviously leveraging their pre-sales engineer, but they're also bringing in executives at the right moment. They're bringing in, references that have, from the ecosystem in the right way at the right time in the sales cycle. And they're almost like playing a backseat role sometimes of playing orchestrator versus being
yes.
just the loudest voice in the room.
Yeah. Very good point. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think the other piece that I kind of connects both those things is, learning being, and John, this is one I learned from you, is like being a great listener. The best sellers ask the best questions and just extract information and get, that arm that organization that they're going to bring to bear with all the right points that they need to bring up by first deeply understanding what's happening in the business, what's driving the champion, what's top of mind for them. So I think those are some of the things that really stick out. And I've been lucky that I've had the privilege of working with a lot of great, sellers across various companies through my career. And those are kind of the things that if I try to simplify it, it comes down to.
Yeah. Really good.
How about the sales leader? If you go up one level, what you just said, Sahir, is so powerful because you've got all these, I call them the 100-pound brains, and you're definitely in that category.
Sorry
The
about
100-pound brains inside the company.
I don't know. That's
And the companies that do it the best, I think,
yeah,
the companies that do it the best are the ones that harness the knowledge of how a customer buys and therefore documents how we're going to
yeah,
engage, what it's going to take to engage, what stages we're going to do, what exit criteria, and then a clear understanding of how we're going to engage the Sahirs of the world. It's got to be qualified, customers got to be qualified, we've got to be qualified. So it's like that next level of you can go hire that talent that has that intellectual curiosity. They can gather the resources. But if you don't have at a company level, meaning the sales leader mind, that says, I'm going to build an engagement model around the interaction and orchestrate the interaction of that, you're not going to be a great company because you're going to, the best sellers, they're going to hoard all the resources, which you would expect them to do. We're going to wear out the Sahirs of the world. We're going to have people working on unqualified deals. And that's how companies they can't scale. And I know if you work with
definitely.
Johnny, you were in good
Yeah.
orchestration. You were in good orchestration.
Yeah, Cap, I'm totally with you because there's almost like layers of this. Like, the question I was answering earlier was more about like the characteristics of the individual contributor or seller.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of at the leadership level, it's a few things. I think it's the operational rigor kind of aspects that I think you're bringing up in terms of a playbook and resource management and
Yes.
really, territory management, all the things that kind of go into that. But I also think it's culture. I've also seen not so great sales organizations where there just isn't a culture of accountability, where there isn't that, it's marketing didn't give me leads or, oh, I don't know how to run my forecast because it's a consumption-based business. Like at the end of the day, like, that's just to me a cultural challenge that I've seen with, some of the sales organizations that are not as high performing as the ones that, John and I have had the privilege of, kind of working on together. And I think the other piece that kind of fits into that from a leadership level is just a deep investment in enablement. I mean, you can have somebody who's intellectually curious and incredible, but if you don't define their ideal customer profile, you don't teach them about the technology, you don't take the best learnings from the best sellers, and then make it programmatic such that you can ramp the next generation of sellers in the organization, then you can never do it in a repeatable way at scale. And so I think that really has to start from the top. And it's not an easy decision because for many sales leaders, the easy answer is give me just more quota capacity. That'll solve itself in terms of, driving the revenue. But the reality is the better dollars might be spent elsewhere on these leverage, functions that are harder to maybe attribute the impact of, but actually can unlock the scalability of the organization.
Well said. That's going to be a clip that's going to be replayed over and over and over again. That was well said.
Yeah, well done. So here we're going to get to, your role now as a venture capitalist, but before you became a VC, you did do a bunch of advising and even investing in companies. And
Sure.
when you look back at that time, you were still an operator also. But what are some of the aspects of the startup companies that made it versus the ones that didn't? Can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about why some of them made it and why some of them didn't make it?
In terms of the actual founders or entrepreneurs that, especially in the companies that I, was an angel investor or early advisor in, I think the thing that really sticks out is what the spread is between the entrepreneurs that really leverage the resources they have outside the company and those who don't. If I think about the winners, they're the CEOs or the executive teams that, treat me like I work for the company. They're calling me every week on something and, bouncing ideas and all of that. And then I think of the other end of the spectrum where it's like, all right, you've got this amazing set of angel investors and hopefully I'm one of them around the table that can add a lot of value. But like crickets, after that initial investment, which, it just tells you a lot about like the mindset of the team in terms of how insular they are, or just not even recognizing like how to, bring a lot of help around the table to get the best outcome for the company. And, when I first started advising or angel investing, I just assumed that it would be like obvious, but there's a real disparity there. I'm sure you've seen this, John, as well, in
Yeah.
terms of leveraging
But
for
I don't
help.
understand why. I don't
Yeah.
understand why they don't use those resources.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me. And then, and I think the other piece is just it kind of comes back to what I mentioned earlier around this idea of either coherence between the go-to-market and distribution model and the product, or overweighting the culture of the organization where only one side of that has too much resource, too much focus. And it's either like a sales-led company or it's a engineering-led company. The reality is the best companies are the ones that have a healthy balance of that in the organization. Sometimes there's tension in between that, and it's product's job to kind of mitigate and mediate that in a lot of ways. But I think you really, it's easy for the culture of an organization to swing in one direction or another. And maybe early on, that's fine to be very engineering focused and all of that. But the most successful companies treat both with equal intensity. And if you have one side of that kind of being weak, it's really hard to build a big app.
I got one that I'd like to throw on the table
Yeah.
that I've seen. It's a telltale marker of whether I'm going to have a good time or a bad time in advising a company. But it's this technical founder that sales is almost a bad word, or
Yes.
and I want to even be kinder. I want to say there's no intellectual curiosity about go to market. There's like it's going to solve itself. Why can't these people just understand the value of the product? They're talking about the customers.
Yep.
And then they're talking about why are we paying those people so much to be able to go and sell? When a technical founder is struggling with that and they're not open, they rarely make it.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's like a huge red flag to me in terms of just if that's the mindset. And, it's totally fine to not have the skill set and never
Yeah.
seen it before. That's very common, but that can be solved by intellectual curiosity, bringing some great people around the table, hiring well, all of those types of things. But if the mindset is just like, oh, those are second class citizens in the organization and, the technical folks are the only people that really, are creating value for the enterprise. I just think that's completely false in terms of how to build.
Or they're thrilled to give out $1 million bonus check.
Yeah.
or they give
Yeah,
out $1 million bonus check and their handshake and they look like they want to throw up. I mean, it's
totally.
seriously. And I think that's why you guys have done so well in the marketplace is because you've understood the connection between the two. The product market fit. Somebody said it in the beginning, Johnny or Sahir, one of you said it. The product market fit means nothing without a go-to-market fit. And
Yeah, and listen, the reality is in situations, it's you're pushing in one direction or the other. Some of the sales
yes,
leaders that I'm sure will watch this and be like, I don't know what Sierra's talking about. We were always, at each other because there were many times I had to push back on sales, for various things that they were asking for, or where I didn't think, they were delivering based on the commitments, they were responsible for if I were putting something on the roadmap. So it's not always black and white that, the field is always right. But I think in the aggregate in the industry, because just the very nature of technical companies often being started by technical founders, it tends to rotate more in the direction that you're talking about, Cap.
well said. Well said.
Along those same lines, though, just to, add more to that, I've seen it where the founders believe that everyone's going to buy their baby,
Yes.
and in the first couple
Yeah.
sales,
Yeah.
they actually make the first couple sales.
Yeah.
So they think they could sell it and they can sell it to anybody. So why do I need these salespeople? And because they think that everyone's going to buy their baby, they put resources in the wrong places. So they're putting resources on, giant financial services companies, selling to the government, selling to big insurance companies, things that are going to take forever for almost any sales force to sell into. They don't take the time to really think hard about the ICP and where I'm going to gain the most amount of productivity
Yeah.
from my company and generate the most value for the customer. So big mistakes. They waste resources, they waste time.
Right.
And then sometimes it's just too late. Even though it's a great product, it's just too late.
It's easy to say, I want to go after JP Morgan Chase or some large enterprise because, the big dollars are there. The complexity of doing that, I think, is drastically underestimated by a lot of founders who have never actually seen those environments, both from the complexity of selling, in terms of how hard it is to orchestrate a decision with real dollars in those organizations, but also just the product requirements. Like there's a lot of roadmap that is really specific to highly regulated financial services, insurance, et cetera, that's expensive to build. And
Right.
sequencing that in the right way at the right time is super critical. I mean, I believe a lot of companies do need to get up market to ultimately be big, large businesses. But I think being intentional about it, both from an investment standpoint in the field, but also in the engineering roadmap is I think
Yeah.
sometimes
How
lacking.
about FedRAMP? That took a
Oh
while.
my goodness.
You
That's
know,
where we need some
That one
regulatory
hurt.
reform.
That
I
one
think
hurt.
that's the way to fix that.
one last point on that, not to just bash technical founders, because
No, no, no.
I want to explain what I've seen there because they're brilliant. And when I find the real difficult ones are when they do come from the JP Morgan Chase, like they come from those environments where they started to develop a technology and they had some ideas, they couldn't get it spread throughout either the big company, and then they go off and they start a smaller company. I'm not talking about the people that started in their garage or what have you, but a lot of them started in these bigger environments. And the only, I think the language that works with them is they're just unconsciously competent because they go out and sell in those environments and they say, well, this is how we did it at JP Morgan Chase, or this is how we did it in the Israeli Air Force, or whatever. They have huge competency because they've done things in those environments. And the only missing link is they're just unconsciously competent on how to get that information out of their heads. It's there, but get it into the hearts and minds of the sellers in what I call a 3-foot conversation. And that's called sales consumable. And it's not really that difficult, but if you just have to be open. If you're a technical founder, you're struggling with go to market, a lot of times it's not that you don't have the answers, they're in your head. What you haven't done is translated them into go to market language that will allow people to be successful in a 3-foot conversation without your brain, without your vast knowledge and experience. That's going to come over time, but it's not going to be there on day one. And they
Yeah.
they really struggle with it.
And I think from an engineering perspective, I think it's very easy for an organization to slip into, and I've seen this like into the idea that engineers don't talk to customers, because we've got
Yeah.
product as the first, layer around that, and then obviously the field is going to feed input into the product. But, I think I found the best engineers want to be directly involved with the customers as well. And there's kind of in this engineering, the CTOs, the VPs of engineering that kind of create that culture, I think are really, really powerful, because the reality is no matter how great your product organization is, there's nothing like getting an engineer to speak to a practitioner who's using their product directly and, from time to time. It can't be, taking all the hours in the day. It's not their fundamental job, but getting the right exposure of that can really create an incredible empathy and connection across the functions internally in the organization, but also leads to a better product when engineers have a real feel for how their technology is being used. And it's not, telephone translated between three abstracted organizations, before it gets to them.
And then they change their communication style. Those same engineers and same product people change their communication style to the sellers that says, hey, let me explain to you why this is such a big problem for a customer.
Yeah.
Like they help the seller stand in the moment of pain of the user.
Yep.
And when you do that, it's gold. If you just say, hey, this feature is like 10 times better than XYZ competitor, the best companies, I believe, are the ones that change their language to put it into. It's just, you said it earlier in the beginning of the podcast. You said you were you looked at everything as a sales interaction. And it's what problem are you solving? How do you solve it? How do you solve it differently or better? And, what's the value of it? I always used to ask the engineers, so what? They tell me something like, hey, this is a new feature. And I would just say, so what? Right. What I meant to say was, what does it have to do with a problem that a customer has? And then how do we do that differently or better than anybody else? And the engineers, the technical people that learn that language, they kill it. They kill it because it shows up in front of a customer.
You reminded me of so my first week as a sales engineer back at BladeLogic, I was doing a mock demo to my manager. And I remember I was like, check out this feature. It's really neat. And he's like, stop right there. Nobody gives a crap if it's neat. You got to explain why. What does it actually solve? And what's the pain that it's going after? And, that I remember that moment of never say neat.
Well, the problem with that sometimes, Sahir, the problem with that is when you're talking to like engineers are talking to engineers and you say it's really neat, that other engineer can look at that and go, you're right. That's incredibly neat. Because I learned that at PTC is when the engineers were talking to engineers, they're like, oh my God, like that's amazing. And what I always struggled with was, why is that amazing? Like, because I didn't know. I didn't know how long it took them. I didn't know. And just adding in that next level of what impact is that going to have on the business is amazing.
All right. So here you know, a venture capitalist at Index Ventures.
Eddie Warbucks.
Let's talk a little bit about your transition from, chief product officer over to being a VC. And you talked earlier about relearning, new jobs every 18 months. Were there certain things that you need to learn or unlearn as a VC?
Yeah, I think, it's sort of the shift sort of happened organically. As you mentioned, John, I was getting more involved with, sort of angel investing and, advising companies. I sat on a couple boards. And at the time, I was spending quite a bit of my day job at MongoDB in the founder ecosystem, trying to learn about AI and its implications for MongoDB, as well as building up our little ventures fund. So all these kind of things were happening just in my day-to-day that kind of got me to the point where I was like interested in making a career change in my 40s, which has its anxiety in itself in terms of, being in many ways in an incredible role at MongoDB, a company that's like continuing to crush it and to make that change. So
you still look like you're 25.
In his 40s.
I think the lighting is hiding the grays that have proliferated.
In his 40s.
So when he first came into the office at BladeLogic, I remember coming out of my office when he was walking in with, who is your manager again?
Damon Miller.
Damon Miller. So he's walking in with Damon Miller, and I was like, oh, this looks interesting. Somebody's bringing their kid to work. So bring your kid to work day. So I had to go over and say, hey, who are you? Yeah, I'm Sahir Azam. Well, what do you do? Well, he said, it's my first day at work. I'm going to be an application engineer. And I was like,
Yeah, that was the same
okay,
day as the neat
all right.
comment.
Yeah. And then like 2 weeks later, he was super impressive, super impressive.
Thanks, John.
Still looking good, brother. You still look good.
Trying. But yes, that was kind of how the transition happened. I think on the other side of it, I was like, there's a handful of great funds where I think it's worth doing the job. And if it's not one of them, I think it's a very tough job. And, Index luckily is a, top tier. We've had an incredible run over the last 30 years and, super excited to be part of the team here. I think there's just kind of two things that over the last, 6, 7 months that have been interesting to me. One, uniquely, it comes back to how much of the job is the sales job. You're serving entrepreneurs with, key help along the way of the hardest job there is, in many ways, building a company. And so whether that's advice at the right moment or introducing some critical leadership hires or customer intros to the first lighthouse customer in a particular area, that's a service and sales job at the end of the day. And, capital in many ways is a commodity. And so selling the value of yourself and the firm you're representing is the job. And, in a market right now that's super, high velocity, I just flew across the pond, last night because of a very active deal. It's like, it is a sales job in many ways. So I think knowing that from the outside, was true, but it was obvious. But then like feeling that day to day has been definitely one aspect of the transition. And I think the other is time management is very different than it is as an operator. An operator, like, yes, as an executive, you've got to prioritize and choose where to spend your time, but there's a natural operating rhythm to the company. There's an operating rhythm with your team. There's an operating rhythm with the quarter in terms of financial results and executive meetings and team meetings and one-on-ones. So your calendar is easily swamped just by keeping the business running on, and doing all the hygiene you need to kind of keep that going. Here, I feel like there's many different ways of doing the job. Even within our own partnership, partners work in different ways, and figuring out the right operating rhythm of not just filling up my calendar with meetings just because I can take calls with interesting companies. It might be better served that I spend 2 hours reading about something, in the middle of the day, which feels like totally, weird as, spending
Right.
15 to 20 years with my calendar back to back in terms of, meetings. So I think definitely that aspect of, the cyclicality, the urgency that can come up suddenly if a really important opportunity comes up, and then really reflecting on, am I spending my time in the right way to have the best prepared mind to find the right entrepreneur and right opportunity. Those are the things that are just quite different than being in an operating and leadership context.
Well, and on the first point, you have to sell yourself too, right? Yeah. I mean, like you said, the money spends the same way from any venture capitalist firm, right? Yeah. So you have to sell yourself on what you can do for that company. And there's many VCs out there that talk about, here's all the things I can do for you. Then they get on your board and they just come and eat your donuts and drink your coffee and ask questions that you wonder if they even know what investment they made. So it's really helpful to find a VC that can actually, help you as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and I think on that point, not all, even amongst the top tier of venture funds, like there are differences, right, in terms of the incentive model, the engagement model, and I think sometimes entrepreneurs are just indexing on a particular brand or a particular, sort of check size or valuation or whatever it might be. But I think the smartest entrepreneurs are actually looking to understand, okay, is this the right partner at the right firm for where I am in building my business? Just as a anecdote, I was, talking to an entrepreneur recently, and they're like, oh, well, your competition is offering 100 intros to, CIOs. I'm like, you don't have a single salesperson. So what happens when you get those 100 intros? They're not all going to suddenly turn into revenue. Like, who's going to prosecute those opportunities, understand which ones are qualified, move them through a sales process, let alone deliver on that? Like, you're not at that stage yet. They may be incredible later on in the journey, but right now you need help building the team and the infrastructure around you to even be able to get to that point, just as an anecdote. And so, really being thoughtful around the differences there. Also just the incentive structure. Some funds are very much, it's the partner that sponsored the deal. They're all in maybe, with you, but the rest of the partnership or the rest of the fund doesn't even really care because it's not their portfolio company.
Right.
Index in that way is quite different. We're an equal partnership, so everyone's incentivized to jump in and help and make, companies successful. But I think really figuring out which fund around which stage, the partner you're working with and the incentive structure behind the fund that you choose is something that has a lot of nuance behind it that especially first-time entrepreneurs may not fully realize.
Let's talk a little bit about AI. You made
Yeah.
Let's
I think
go.
I think
AI,
you
imagine
Let's
that.
go.
I want to talk about one of your investments because you wrote about the shift from clicks and screens to AI agents that see, hear, and speak. You
Yes.
made an investment in LiveKit. So talk a little bit about that and what maybe the UI, because it's not going to be clicks and screens, it's going to be see, hear, and speak.
Yeah.
What does a UI look like next year or the year after? What do the UIs look like?
Yeah, this
Hey,
is
before
something.
you do that, Johnny,
Yeah.
can you go
Yeah.
back one level back because I need to nerd out here a little bit.
Oh boy.
You're going to nerd
Here we
out
go.
for
You're
me.
going to nerd out
I
against
don't
the
know.
year. That's not going to work
No,
well.
no, no.
Come on.
I need Sahir to do
I'm
it
that
for
big a
me.
nerd.
No, I need Sahir to do it for me,
Look at
Johnny.
this sweater,
You don't
man.
have to be that big of a nerd to go up against Cap. That's the point. I could nerd him out.
Are you done? Are you
Yeah.
done?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to talk about before you go into the user interface, when you talk about inference versus inference is the new runtime. Like this was making a lot of sense to me for a lot of different reasons on both the buying side of AI, the using side of AI. Could you explain what you mean there? And then we can go into like user interface, because I think this is a big part of what you're actually bringing to knowledge to the market right now.
Yeah, I think on the inference comment that you're referencing is in relation to a company called Fireworks AI that's in our portfolio. And it's a company I actually started working with at MongoDB because we participated in the Series B investment. And they build a software layer that powers some of the most, widely used AI products in the world today. And inference is really about serving models in real time, in production, at high quality, high performance, and also doing it in a costly way. And one of the things that's a challenge with AI right now is many companies' COGS are just really consumed by the underlying model costs. And therefore, the economics and unit economics of the business overall are quite weak. And what Fireworks has been able to do is introduce technology to bring open source models to bear at much lower cost, good performance, but then allow the customer to fine tune that based on reinforcement learning techniques to be very high quality and high performance for their specific use case. And that's why they're taking off. They're one of the, AI high flyers with just an incredible revenue ramp into the hundreds of millions in a short amount of time.
But talk
Yeah.
about what the impact, because
Yeah.
this one is messing me up a little bit because I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, I wasn't even thinking about this. Because in the AI world, not like the MongoDB world, and you describe it, I've heard you describe it as, I think it's like deterministic, or so I go in,
Yeah.
I ask for an answer, I ask for a question, and the database gives me back the answer. Now
Yep.
we have not an exact answer, we have approximations of answers, and we have iterations of that. Can you just explain to the layman people what that really means to users, what it means to cost, what it means to actually selling this to people that think that they're going to get 100% answer back, and they might not get the 100% answer back? How do you minimize hallucinations? This for me is like very, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of bridges sort of both Fireworks that I just mentioned in terms of being this core new primitive that AI applications need beyond just standard compute storage and networking, but how to serve these models effectively. And I think what John was talking about with the very nature of applications changing with companies like LiveKit powering those new experiences. So if you think about like more traditional software, they're kind of very predictable and deterministic in nature. Code has a very reliable set of outputs, which means that it's very good for a certain set of tasks in knowledge work that we're all used to. And so, this is accounting, this is, customer management. These are all the kind of applications that we're typically, involved with. But generative AI, by its very nature, can now start to reason and solve problems that are much more open-ended than something you could just code in a very deterministic way with software, which is why everyone's so excited, because now software and technology can go after a whole range of problems that previously could only be solved by labor. And you hear a lot of this idea of, AI is going after the services and labor budget, not necessarily the traditional IT and software budget.
Yeah.
It's because it's automating problems that were never been able to be automated by technology before. And now the difference there, though, is you talked about deterministic versus probabilistic, is you're not necessarily going to get the same result every time out of an AI model, even if you ask the same question, and you got to deal with, potential hallucinations or not understanding your own internal data or policies while consuming the answer. And there's a whole ecosystem of technologies that are being built to help improve the quality, reliability of these models such that they can be brought to mission critical use cases, especially in regulated industries. So that's continuing to progress. But I think the exciting part for me is like, if you that classic Mark Andreessen quote of software eating the world or whatnot, the last 15 years, we've all seen software, all across our personal and business lives. I think we're barely seeing where the world is going in terms of it now becoming even more pervasive in how we do work, how we live, and how we actually, interact with technology in general. And so I think we're at the very early innings of that. Now, talking about sort of the nature of that software changing, the way we interact with software is also changing.
Yeah.
It's no longer just applications on a home screen of your phone or web pages on your computer. You're seeing natural language, as an example, become a modality that we all use now with AI. If you think about, you pull open your favorite model, you pull open ChatGPT or you pull open XAI or Grok or whatnot, they all have sort of ways of interacting for consumers in natural voice, right? And we can talk back to you, have a conversation. But that's also making itself into the enterprise. Think about how much money is spent in call centers around the world where you have to have somebody picking up the phone, often outsourced overseas, just to collect some basic information. More and more of those interactions are going to be driven by voice agents across a variety of different areas. Let's say it's a bank auto-dialing somebody to make sure that it's not a fraudulent transaction. That's something that can be easily automated by an agent right now. And so you're seeing kind of voice become a pervasive way of interacting, but you're also starting to see, video. And if you really look out there, voice and video and human interaction, think about where the world's going with robotics. We're all talking about, humanoid robots or household robots or manufacturing and robotics really taking off in the next, decade or so. When that happens, how do these machines interact with the physical world? They do so through cameras and they do so through microphones. And so that has implications for the complete underlying infrastructure stack. If you're talking to an agent, it needs to feel very natural. You're going to hang up the phone if you're very obviously talking to a machine and not a human. So it has to be able to converse with you in a way that feels like you're speaking to a real human. That's a very hard challenge, both at the model layer, the infrastructure layer, to make sure that's high performance and low latency. Same thing goes with a robot. If a robot's interacting with the real world, it needs to be able to have computer vision, understand those environments, course correct, and make safe decisions so it doesn't hurt people around you. That's a whole different level of infrastructure, models, technology that's required for that to be applied. And I think we're going to get into a world that's even more kind of ambient and proactive, where maybe you're not even asking your phone or your computer to do anything, but there's a variety of things around you in the real world that are helping you along the way, and I think you see glimpses of things like that with Meta's glasses or whatnot, where they're mixing kind of the real world with the digital world and just being much more integrated as opposed to interacting with a computer. And so all of this is, I think we're starting to see glimpses of in the industry, but what it means to me is just like the idea of software being this static thing that we interact with on a flat 2D environment to being something that's much more integrated into our lives is where things are going. And so from an investment perspective, that's been where I'm spending a lot of my time. I talked about fireworks in terms of serving these models for more and more of these critical applications. LiveKit, which is the voice and video infrastructure to deliver those at high performance, low latency. So the quality and experience is really great. Other companies in our portfolio, ClickHouse, who's serving the data layer behind many of these applications. There's kind of a theme here around AI infrastructure that's very different than the traditional cloud platforms and software stack that we're used to for this, traditional deterministic software you
Will
referenced.
you just stay there for just a second and go to that level of AI infrastructure? We've got a lot of people that are getting recruited by AI firms and the allure of AI firms. You're now talking about different layers. You're talking about AI infrastructure. Could you just give the layman view of like where are all the opportunities to join in the AI market if you're a seller, and maybe just some of the where you think the hot ones are going to be?
It's incredible right now because I think the expansiveness of just innovation because of AI and what people are willing to invest in is just so broad. Like, if you rewound 3, 4 years ago before this big AI boom, it was like trying to find the small micro, SaaS company for a vertical that hasn't been touched. And it was kind of narrow. There wasn't like a lot of, innovation happening, but now it's really touching every layer. And I think the way I tend to break it down is certainly there are application layer companies that are applying AI to go after various problems. I talked about customer, support agents via voice, but, there's automated SDR companies. There's companies that are focused on, every domain and function of the company, trying to think about how AI can, improve the productivity of the knowledge workers in those spaces, and let alone the consumer side. But so there are definitely application tier companies, many of which are fighting it out right now. I think the big question mark always with the application companies that the ecosystem's always debating. Who knows what the right answer is what are the models just going to eat versus what's really going to be differentiated and deep enough to be sticky and durable over time. Then there's sort of where I've spent a fair amount of my time thus far, and where my portfolio companies are really in that kind of powering those applications, which is the infrastructure layer. I tend to like that as a product thinker, just because it's a way to index a big wave of the market, and you don't have to pick necessarily which winner in which application segment is going to be the next driver of consumption. As long as you're doing a great job capturing a broad swath of companies, you can kind of let all flowers bloom and kind of grow with that. And
you're the plumbers.
Yeah.
You're the plumbers.
He's selling picks and shovels to the gold miners.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
And I saw that at MongoDB, and there's a whole wave of that happening at various forums in the AI space. But also, like, for the first time in a long time, the underlying hardware infrastructure is changing too. You're seeing a lot of innovation and specialization in semis, which, for a long time, venture investors hadn't touched. There was kind of a dark period there, but now there's a lot of innovation happening there. New forms of memory, new forms of networking technologies, all the way down to energy as well. People are investing in, hardware for, data center power and nuclear generation, because there's just, the core bottleneck for everything right now is energy, which then feeds GPUs and chipsets that then drive these models, which drives intelligence that drives all these applications. And so you're seeing kind of every layer of that have investments in innovation for the first time, and I think a long time, in terms of the dynamism of new companies being formed. And so, where values accrues, I think there's going to be winners in every one of those layers. The hard job is figuring out which are the ones that are going to be long term. That's always, a top of mind for people like me. But I think as a seller, it's a really interesting time, because there is so much opportunity that's driven by AI, even if it isn't an AI direct company, one of the flashy names that we hear about all the time. And so, there is, I think,
that was amazing. That was amazing. You nerded out well, dude. That was amazing. Thank you.
Really good. Now you're seeing tons of AI pitches, and so a lot of on the app side, a lot of the stuff that I'm seeing just seems like an LLM wrapper around a little bit of an application and a bunch of data. And then people think that that's really AI, but I'm not seeing a lot of apps that are built with tons of domain experience and truly AI native apps yet.
Yeah, I think it's early. And I think even beyond the new vendors or startups, I think it's even earlier in large enterprise, where I think there's still scratching the surface to figure out how to differentiate their business in a unique way. Yeah, they're buying some of these apps, to your point, John, but they're not necessarily there yet in terms of applying it in a broad-based way to their business for custom applications that really define their business. I think both sides are quite early. Clearly, the startups and the ecosystem there move faster, so we're seeing more shots on goal in terms of trying new things there in many ways.
Spoken from a former goalie.
Yeah, long time ago, but I miss
Long
those
time
days.
ago.
But
Now, what about you in
yeah.
your current job as an investor? I heard that you're like a fan of Perplexity and maybe even like Gemini Deep Research. Are there certain tools that have found their way into your daily life as
Yeah,
an investor?
yeah, absolutely. I know they're maybe not as buzzy as they once were, but I continue to use Perplexity because I think they have the fastest, snappiest, best search experience in a lot of ways. And they've got some new cool stuff like the computer product that I'm playing around with, but it's early. On my work side of things, I'm totally Claude pilled. I know we since we invested in Anthropic, I've really gone deep into trying to really work with Claude in terms of not only research but automating a lot of the workflow that I have day in day as an investor. And there's a lot of buzz in the last few months about how even Claude Code is now being used by people who are not writing code day to day, like myself. And so I feel like that product is definitely keeps getting better. And, I think it's very early, but I try to be very broad. I use Claude all in on my business and professional work. I use ChatGPT daily for my personal life, and it knows everything about me. And, it is now even surfacing up proactive recommendations. I use Perplexity for search.
Wow.
So I tend to, try to get as broad of a view because I do think things are changing. They're always one-upping each other and all of that. And we even started, there's a lot of internal usage of AI at Index, and we do a lot of hackathons and showing each other kind of what the latest things are. So I am a believer in this technology overall, though. I think it's
Oh,
early to your
certainly.
point, but
Absolutely.
it's
It's still
incredible.
early.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I see my own token usage going up almost like week over week in terms of how I use it.
Hey,
Now,
Johnny, I got to ask,
yeah, go for it.
um, and I don't want to take it offline. Yeah, I don't want to take it in the wrong direction if you want to go somewhere else, but I would like Sahir to comment on this. The death of the seat of a SaaS software, is that real?
Yeah, I think this is a hot and active debate, and I was thinking about this, like probably about a year ago. There was that big public spat between Mark Benioff from Salesforce and Satya from Microsoft about systems of record being dead or not or whatnot. And I do think that there are some structural headwinds for SaaS companies, especially ones that are seat based, because if the number of knowledge work employees, if you believe it's going to shrink, some people don't think. Some people think it'll just grow because we'll be all more productive. I don't know where I stand on that argument, but I think that if you believe that organizations are going to be leaner, then by definition there's going to be less seats to sell. But I think about it even in terms of my prior life at MongoDB, and just to use like illustrative numbers because I don't really know what the real numbers are, but let's say there are 6,000 person company, maybe half the company has Salesforce licenses, and many of those are in the field, they're using it day in day. I ran a product organization. I don't know, maybe there were 100 licenses of Salesforce or in the product organization. I could probably write on a napkin the questions a product manager goes into Salesforce for a couple times a week. Who's the rep or CS lead on an account? What's the product mix? What's the current ARR? Those are the things that are probably being looked up. Do I really need a full-on license for Salesforce for that, or can I just put an LLM on top of the data warehouse export and answer that question a lot easier without necessarily needing that license?
Or the flip side could be
Yeah.
that everyone has Salesforce and you're only charged on consumption.
Yeah, exactly.
So
And so now then it goes to, okay, does that mean that the category of all SaaS companies that are seat-based is dead? No, I don't believe that at all. I think that's way more about the individual situation of the company, the strength of the leadership, how much they're willing to overcome innovators' dilemma and actually, change their product and pricing, integrate AI into it, or whether they're just going to be stuck, with the inertia of their prior lives. And that is company specific. It's about how bold the leadership is, how much risk they're willing to take, how they're able to manage their investors through that change. And so I tend to avoid these broad-based, all SaaS is dead kind of, doom and gloom. And because I think a lot of it comes down to execution at the end of the day. And as we know, some companies are going to well execute through these transitions, and some companies are really going to struggle and not be able to overcome those headwinds for a variety of reasons that aren't necessarily just structural.
That's a great point. The last point I want to add to it is what the impact is happening on the seller right now. If you are, and I think these are two critical things based upon what you just said, if you are not understanding what is going to happen with the ecosystem of data, the system of record, or what have you, for your solution, you could have the greatest solution for that organization, for that problem that you're solving. You are now going to get introduced, I believe, to people that are trying to understand what's going to happen to the other licenses inside the company. So your deals, I'm seeing it right now. Deals are getting elongated. Everybody's on board. It's got a great return. And somebody says, do we need all those Salesforce licenses? Or somebody says something else. If you're not doing that proactively, and I'm not saying you personally can say, oh, I can tell you how many Salesforce licenses you're not going to use. But if you aren't multi-threading in those conversations, you're going to get stalled. I'm watching it happen right now on forecasts.
Yeah. And Salesforce is pretty critical to the organization, super
not going away
and all of that. But think about the, 50 tools around that that have, just are solving a very unique point thing because it's a deterministic piece of software for a particular kind of narrow problem. But now you can apply AI to the problem and really orchestrate and automate away a lot of the fragmentation that's been there. I mean, there's not a single CIO of a large enterprise I know that isn't thinking about tools consolidation in some way, 100%. Shape, or form, and thinking about how I can, remove a lot of the cost structure there, not only on the tool side, let alone, the manual effort. So, yeah, I think that there are real headwinds, but I think that does not mean the incumbents are necessarily going to be the losers, because I think there are a lot of strong operators there that see it coming. And it's not like 15 years ago where, the legacy companies were asleep at the wheel. Today, every strong CEO is paying attention to what's happening in the ecosystem. They're paranoid by definition and are willing to make bets to disrupt themselves in a way that just was not the status quo.
And who's to say those big system of record companies aren't sitting back and waiting?
No.
And going to go gobble up with all the cash.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to bet against Benioff. He can buy his way into new markets. He's got thousands of engineers building the right agent interface for Salesforce. I'm not saying it's definitely the winner, but it's not so simple as to just say because it's SaaS or seat-based, things go away.
Well done.
So one more question, Sahir. Since we have a bunch of salespeople on this podcast, are there any new AI sales products you've seen or out there that you believe are going to disrupt the enterprise sales process, as it stands today, or anything you see on the horizon?
It's harder for me to pick a particular name, though. I've been personally using Granola quite a bit, which I think is magical in terms of its ability to keep me focused on a conversation and summarize in a succinct way and not just give me a raw transcript. I find that very personally useful in terms of just my own workflow. And I know that's very applicable, and I'm sure there are many sellers who have heard of it or are starting to look at tools like that. But I think at a more macro level, there's no question the job of sales is going to change in a meaningful way and be assisted by technology. Like I think about research, right? You're looking at trying to understand your company, distill what's in their S1s, what are the key initiatives for the executives, build the value pyramid up in terms of how to align your technology to that. That used to take hours and hours and hours of painstaking work. And now it's, you can go have an amazing, probably better version than I could ever create, at least, out of an LLM automatically if you just give it the right resources. And then you merge it with now call transcripts, which gives you real context of truly what the sentiment of a conversation is. It removes a lot of the subjectivity that's just natural in terms of thinking about where you are in an organization, being applying judgment across sellers and teams in a way that's way more neutral than any human could handle. So you talk, John, you like to talk about being the the mirror of reality. Like, I think in many ways, AI can be a mirror of reality of where you are in a sales cycle. Is that person really sending buying signals, or are they actually underneath the language they're using, skeptic? AI is incredible at kind of peeling that out and from a conversation or a transcript in a very kind of neutral way that can sometimes be hard to see, if you're emotionally connected to the environment. And then as a leader, typically if, how many first line managers spend all their time either with their lowest performer and, don't spend enough time with their best performer, or spend, all the time with the best performer, and the lowest performers or the mid performers don't get time. Well, now AI is a coach in real time in terms of what you should be saying, to handle an objection, giving you, feedback in a way that's way more democratized. And then that allows the leader to get a better view of who's progressing as well, and to probably get more leverage in terms of spending time with their team, let alone, automated forecasting and, territory analysis and all these other things that these tools can do. So like, I'm just giving color around every, segment of the job. I see how AI is used and applicable to all aspects of that. Now, what's harder to pick is like, is it going to be 5 AI tools for all those different areas? Is it going to be one platform that does this for both ICs and leaders? I think that's really where I think the battle between these technologies and tools is going to come into play.
And tech sprawl is going to be protected big time for sellers. Big time. You can't throw 15 new applications, 15 new logins onto a seller's workflow. It's just not going to work.
Definitely. But it comes down to that intellectual curiosity. I think the best sellers and leaders are going to be the ones that lean into these tools and differentiate themselves in how they work. And I already seen that, with people I work with. And I think there is a reality. Like I get tons of, inbound pipeline generation emails and have for years. And, if I'm honest, like, AI writes a better PG email targeted to me than the average SDR all day long, and so like, there are going to be certain functions that need to be evolved and changed to, versus the way it's always been done. And I think the people who recognize that as leaders or as ICs and lean into that and leverage these tools as an advantage are the ones that are going to best benefit from it.
I'm getting ready to rip the heads off chickens, McMahon. Let's go. Let's go. Well done. Well done, Sahir. Sahir, unbelievable. I knew I had to take my Prevagen before we got on this podcast. I had to be alert and ready to go, and you didn't disappoint. Thank you so much for coming back on, and congratulations on all your success. And you're amazing, dude. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Here, superstar from the day I met you till today and into the future. Superstar. Love you, man. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Learn a lot from you always, John, every day. So appreciate it. I haven't seen you guys on this probably in a few years. So thanks for having me back. And this was super fun as always.
Yeah. Good, buddy.
Thanks.
Thanks to Sahir Azam. Thanks, John Kaplan. Thanks to everyone for listening to another episode of the Revenue Builders Podcast.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoy the content, please subscribe, rate, and review the show to help us reach more people. This show is brought to you by Force Management, where we help companies improve sales performance, executing the growth strategy at the point of sale. Check out forcemanagement.com for more information.